All right, so we're going to start off reviewing the virus stuff we talked about last time, then we'll try to get into protists, which is our next topic for today. We talked last time that the word virus is, I think it's Italian for poison. And a good definition of a virus would be this three-letter term right here. Three-word term, rather. Obligate, intracellular, parasite. They have to be inside a cell to really do anything. And once they get in, they do bad things to that cell. They harm the cell. One of the most simple kinds of viruses is called a bacteriophage. And if you literally break that word down, what does it mean? Bacteria eater. Phage, P-H-A-G-E, means eat. These are viruses that actually make bacteria sick. And the reason we talk about them is they're pretty simple. They're the most simple case. Most viruses are made out of two parts. A protein coat on the outside, called a capsid, and some kind of genetic material on the inside. And remember, it's either DNA or RNA, not both. Some people who took the test yesterday confused that, and they said that bacteria have DNA or RNA. What do bacteria have? They have DNA and RNA, just like you. They work the same way you do. The viruses have one or the other. There are some viruses called retroviruses. Why are they called retro? Right, they have RNA, which scientists think came first in terms of genetic material. You guys who haven't taken the test yet, that might be a test question. And because they only have RNA, they're an exception to our central dogma. They have an extra step. Because remember, normally the central dogma is DNA to what? Well, a transcription that makes mRNA. And then the mRNA goes through translation to make proteins. And the proteins determine the traits. But these viruses don't have DNA. So their extra step is they have to take their RNA and inject it into the host, along with some enzymes. And those enzymes do what to that DNA, or to that RNA? What's this step called? Reverse transcription. And one of the big deals with that step is that what happens lots of times during that step? It mutates, which makes RNA kind of unstable. It makes retroviruses pretty dangerous because they're always changing. A big thing I want to make sure you get through today is this cycle called the lytic cycle. That's the life cycle of a virus. And it's called lytic because what do they end up doing at the end? Bursting, splitting, cutting your cells open, essentially. Lice. Lytic. It's called the lytic cycle. It's the root's lice. That's what the lytic cycle looks like. What a virus does when it infects your cells is, first of all, it attaches to the cell membrane. And usually it's attaching to a receptor. Now, normally receptors are receiving what kinds of things? Hormones and other signals. Would your cell have a receptor for a virus? No, it's just using a receptor for something else. Once it gets received, though, once it binds to that receptor, what it then does is it injects its DNA or its RNA into the cell. The capsid doesn't go in. The protein coat stays on the outside. The only thing that goes into the cell is either the RNA or the DNA. That's called penetration. Forget about the stuff on the bottom for right now. We'll come back to it in a minute. The third step in the lytic cycle is biosynthesis. Once that genetic material goes in, the cell does what it says to do. It can't tell the difference. And virus DNA typically says to do what? Make more viruses. And that's what starts to happen. Then the pieces get put together. And notice there's only two pieces. There's a capsid and DNA or RNA. And then when there's enough viruses that are made, the cell bursts. That's what's called lysis, and they're released. And they go on and infect many, many other cells. That's the lytic cycle, all the stuff at the top. The normal infection cycle of a virus. But there are some viruses that do this other part. And essentially a virus like this will inject its genetic material, and it actually becomes embedded in the chromosomes of the host cell. So their genetic material becomes part of the host cell's genetic material. And for a long time, what might it be doing? Nothing, just kind of sitting there. Every time the cell reproduces, though, what happens? That virus DNA or RNA is getting reproduced. Eventually, what might cause it to go back into the lytic cycle? What might cause a virus that's hiding in your body to start becoming active again? Stress, immune system problems like HIV, maybe some kind of cancer, some other bad infection, and it just hops back in here and it starts up again. It starts causing symptoms.
If someone were to get a hot shot like as a kid, is it still possible for them to get shingles later on?
The chickenpox shot is pretty new, and I don't think they really have a good grip on how long that shot protects you. So yes, I'd say it's possible. What are some other diseases other than chickenpox, shingles that can do this? Polio may. There's some people that have some after effects of polio. Not usually though. But polio is not one that would usually do this. Herpes, like the STD. The people with that get symptoms and they go away. They get symptoms, they go away, and it just cycles. When they get really stressed or have some kind of health issue, the symptoms show up. They go away and it just cycles back and forth from lytic when it's causing symptoms, when it's doing damage, to lysogenic when it's just sort of hiding in there. We also talked about some viral diseases. We talked about smallpox and polio, and we talked about how that we had vaccines for those for a long, long time. And those vaccines still work. Because those two viruses are what kind of viruses? DNA viruses. That's why they don't mutate very often. But diseases like AIDS and the flu, common cold, and Ebola, those are all what? RNA viruses. And they're constantly changing. So it's almost impossible to have a long-lasting vaccination against them because of all the mutations that are happening. Another thing that we mentioned is if you have a virus disease and you go to the doctor. First of all, does he even usually know what kind of virus it is that you have? Do they actually test for that? How do they know if you have a virus when you go to the doctor? How can the doctor say pretty fairly, hey, you got a virus infection? What's he testing? Not even that usually. He's looking at your white blood cell counts. You got different kinds of white blood cells, and there are certain white blood cells that are in charge of getting rid of viruses. So if there's a lot of those cells, he's got a pretty good bet you probably got a virus. Typically, he's not going to have any idea of what virus it is because they don't test for that. They could. They don't. Because what's he going to tell you if he's a good doctor? Go home, drink some fluids, go to sleep, hope your immune system works, because I can't do much for you. Yeah, there are a few drugs today called antivirals. Who are they usually going to give those to, though? What infections specifically? AIDS. I mean, that's why Magic Johnson is 30 years after getting AIDS, he's still okay. Those medicines are really expensive. A lot of times there's side effects of them. They have one for the flu now. What's it called? Tamiflu. It's an antiviral. But for most virus infections, the treatment still today is go home and let your immune system do its thing. Hope it works. Now, a couple of other things that we didn't mention much the last time. These little things here, viroids. Now, you ought to know by now that word means what? Put OID on the end of something. It means life. It's like a virus. But these are just pieces of RNA. No protein, no capsid, they're just RNA pieces. If that was to get into your body, if one of those was to get into you, you're okay. Because we'll take care of it real quick. Your immune system. But plants don't have a true immune system like us, right? They don't have white blood cells or antibodies. So these things can cause lots of plant infections, plant diseases. Another really scary one that scientists are just really starting to learn about are these things called prions. And these are self-replicating infectious pieces of protein. They're not DNA or RNA based, they're just protein based. And typically, they attack your nervous system, your central nervous system, your brain, and your spinal cord. What's by far the most famous one of those? Mad cow disease. How would you get mad cow disease? Yeah, eating meat from a cow that had it, but let's say you ate a steak from a cow that had mad cow disease. Are you likely to get mad cow disease? Probably not. Because where's this thing concentrate itself at? In the nerves. And when you would be really likely to get it is if you ate like cow brain. Now, I'm not saying you can't get it from eating another part. What meat that people usually eat might you be more in danger of getting mad cow disease from? What part of the cow that people normally eat? Hamburger. Just what's in hamburger. Just throw stuff in there and round it up, right? I mean, let's be realistic. You're probably going to have some nerve stuff in there and other things. And from a steak, you're probably not going to get mad cow disease from a hamburger. There was a weird infection in Africa, and I guess it's still there, called kuru. It's a lot like mad cow disease. It causes brain deterioration. Guess who got it? What kind of people got it in Africa? Cannibals. There are still some cannibals in Africa. If you're a cannibal, and they're always fighting each other, these cannibalistic tribes. If you're a cannibal, what's the biggest insult you can put on your enemy? After you beat him. It's not like spitting on his grave or something. What do the cannibals do to spit on the graves of their enemies? They eat their brains. So what was happening in these cannibalistic tribes is the winners of the war were dying of this disease, but it was essentially like eating their brain, as prion was. And there have been some scientists who've been working with these cannibalistic tribes. It seems like a dangerous job description, right? Scientists who work with cannibals. But they've convinced most of them that, hey, eating brains is a bad idea. Probably shouldn't do that. So this infection is very rare now because there aren't that many cannibals left. There are a few probably, but there aren't many left. And most of them have been educated that if you eat brains, you're going to die. Not a good idea. Some pictures of some viruses. Notice the blue, all that's protein, it's the capsid, and all the red's the DNA. This is the bacteriophage right here. There's a couple more. Remember that plants can get viruses. That's the tobacco mosaic virus. Here's the flu virus. There's our cycle again. 3 words here that you need to make sure you know what they mean. What's a pathogen? Pathogen is anything that can infect you, right? Anything that can make you sick. And I mean, the 2 things that people always think about when they hear pathogen are what? 2 things? Bacteria and virus. Those are the 2 things that come to most people's mind. But let's think outside the box. What are some other human pathogens besides bacteria and viruses? Some other things that can make you sick. Somebody knows something. Well, those are all germs. Specific kind of germ. Some of you have had some of these things before, I know. Besides bacteria and viruses. Still germs. Specific things. Specific one. Worms. All kinds of worm infections, right? If you don't watch the show Monsters Inside Me, it's the most awesome show on television. You need to watch Monsters Inside Me. Awesome, awesome show. Other than worms, what else can make you sick? Yeah, specifically. Usually when we talk about pathogens, we talk about microscopic things. I mean, ticks carry certain kinds of things. Fungi is another one where I was going. How many of you have had like athlete's foot before? I'm man enough to admit that I've had it. You never had it, bro? It's not fun. You don't want it. Yeast infections. There's lots of other fungus infections you can get. And then, let's see, what else? Protozoans. There's some protists that can cause disease. In Africa and South America, what's one of the most common infections? Probably kills more people than any other infectious disease in Africa and South America. You've been reading the hot zone, you've read about it. What do they think the people had when they actually had Ebola? I think a lot of science today. Malaria. That's actually caused by a little protozoa. Eukaryotic protozoa. There are lots of other things on the news lately. Around here, there's been a couple of cases of brain-eating amoebas. You guys heard that on the news? You go out swimming in like a lake. A few days later, you die because your brain's been eaten by amoebas.
Are they, like, do you, like, swallow them, or do they go into
Go through your nasal cavity. Through your brain. Yeah, scary stuff. Point being, there are lots of pathogens out there. You don't need to worry about brain-eating amoebas. It's very rare. Could happen, but it's probably not going to. So don't worry too much about it. What's an epidemic? Yeah, it's an outbreak of a disease in a fairly localized area. Like we might talk about a flu epidemic in Huntsville. So it's an outbreak of disease in a fairly localized area. Whereas if we talk about a pandemic, we're talking about what? Worldwide outbreak. What are probably some of the most famous pandemics that we've had? The Black Death. The swine flu in 1918 killed like 40 million people. Not the swine, the Spanish flu is what I'm thinking, in 1918. What else? Yeah, what I was thinking is HIV. Worldwide infection. There's the flu, pandemics. How many people watch Contagion, the movie? That's really real. Like that could happen. And if it did happen, it would be chaos because the economy would fall to pieces and it would be ugly. Make sure you know what those terms mean. You're going to see those a lot if you're reading through the hot zone. Let's see. Now we want to switch gears and talk about protists. Find my spot here real quick. This diagram didn't translate very well onto the screen, but what kind of diagram is it? A phylogenetic tree. It's supposed to be when you hear that word phylogenetics, what two things are you supposed to think? Evolution and genetics, right? How are things classified based on evolution and genetics? So this is like a family tree of evolution. And this is just a family tree of what group? Oh no, look, it's got some things labeled. Plants, animals, fungi. These are eukaryotes, right? And the group that's not shown on here is which group? The protists. Where would they be on this tree? What's always at the base of the tree? The original, right? The original, the common ancestor for everything above. So you've always heard that this theory of evolution says you evolved from a monkey. Really, what does it say? You evolved from a protist, which evolved from what? A bacteria. That's really what it says. But protists are supposedly the first eukaryotic organisms. That's important to know. First eukaryotic organisms. And when we talk about protists, a term that, for those of you who haven't taken the test yet, here's another hint. There'll be a question about the endosymbiotic hypothesis. Well, they're lucky they happen to be here today. The endosymbiotic hypothesis is the idea of where those prokaryotes came from, where those eukaryotes came from, right? That the first cells were bacteria, and that some smaller bacteria started living inside bigger ones. And eventually that worked out to be a good deal for all of them. It's a symbiotic, mutualistic kind of relationship. And they became so dependent on each other that small and supposedly evolved to become what? Organelles, like mitochondria and chloroplasts. And that's how the first eukaryotic cells formed. That's the theory. Now, today, when you talk about the word protist, it doesn't mean as much necessarily as it used to mean. Probably when you were in ninth grade biology. Question?
Oh, it just, did you say there was eukaryotes? Is it?
Oh, it does. Yeah, that's wrong. It should say thought to be the first eukaryotes. They're not prokaryotes. So if you don't write that down, eukaryotes. I'll fix that. When you were in ninth grade biology, you probably learned of the kingdoms, right? How many kingdoms did you learn about in ninth grade biology? It depends on the book, 6 or 7. Protista is being phased out as a kingdom. Most books don't include it anymore as a kingdom. Because what's this system of classification based on? Now, genetics and evolution, phylogenetics. And as they started looking at the things that had been categorized as protists, started looking at things like their DNA, what did they find? They weren't closely related. And if they're not closely related, does it make sense to put them into the same group? No. So they're kind of being put all over the place. But even so, when we did consider it a kingdom, Protista, sometimes it was called the junk drawer of the classification system. It was one of those things where if it didn't fit as a bacteria, it didn't fit as a plant, it didn't fit as an animal, you just called it a protist and hope for the best. So to begin with, the kingdom didn't make a whole lot of sense. But when we talk about protists, pretty much all of them are single celled. There are a few exceptions. There are animal-like protists, and there are plant-like ones. And we'll talk about those two in a minute. But regardless, they're all eukaryotic. And those are about the only two things they have in common. Single-celled and eukaryotic. Some of them are autotrophic, which means what? Make their own food. Literally, it means self-feeding. Some of them have to eat, though. Some of them are heterotrophic. Some of them have cell walls. Some of them don't. So they're very different. The plant-like ones we tend to call algae, and the animal-like ones we call protozoans. But they're both called protists. What's that word protozoan actually mean? If you break it down into pieces. Proto means first, and zoo means animal. But they're not really animals. It might be better to call them proto-eukaryotes, right? So supposedly the first eukaryotic organisms. We're going to talk first about the protozoans, the animal-like ones. Probably won't get to the algae today. Protozoans are grouped based on locomotion. What is locomotion? How they move. The method they use to move with. That's how they're grouped. Hey, what's up? Can you open the door? Yeah. Alright, back to what I was saying. They're grouped based on how they move. The protozoans usually don't have cell walls, but they can move. They're motile. The algae, on the other hand, are grouped based on the pigments that they have. What's a pigment? What is a pigment? Tell me that. Okay, but what's it made out of? It's a protein. A protein that absorbs certain wavelengths of light and reflects other ones, right? Chlorophyll, for example, is a pigment that's green because why? What does it absorb? Reds and blues, and reflects green. So what we see is what's getting reflected. What's not getting used. There are some things that we call algae that are multicellular, and they're often grouped as plants instead of protists. A lot of the algae are beginning to be grouped as plants instead of protists because of the whole phylogenetic thing. A lot of algae make up what we call phytoplankton. Now those letters, P-H-Y-T, we're going to see those a lot in this class. What's phyte or phyto mean? It means like a plant. Like a plant. Phyte. Like a plant. And what does plankton mean? I mean, that's a word we all throw around, but you may not actually know what it means. What's plankton mean? Where do you find plankton? Where in the ocean? Floating. Plankton are things that float. They can't swim, they float. There's phytoplankton, which are the plant-like parts of the plankton. And what's the other kind of plankton? Phytoplankton and... I'm just full of answers today. You heard of zooplankton? Those are things that float that are a lot like what? Animal-like things. And so you got the plant-like part and the animal-like part. But before we do that, I want to talk about 3 words that are going to show up in this classification. Plankton are things that float. What word is used to refer to things that swim, like fish and dolphins and sharks and stuff? Things that live sort of in the middle part of the ocean water. No? They're called nekton. So these are the things that can swim. They can actively swim. They live in the middle part of the water, the middle of the water column. And then what about things on the bottom? What are they called? Birth of knowledge. Right? Things that live on the bottom are called benthic or benthos. So this would be things like starfish and sea anemones. You've got 3 levels of the stuff in the water. You got the plankton, the floaters, the nekton, the swimmers, and the benthic things are the things that live on the bottom of the water. They might swim, but they're not the strongest swimmers. Starfish can move around if it needs to, but it's not. You don't swim very far. All right, and then one other thing. A lot of these algae can undergo blooms, algal blooms. What does it mean to bloom if you're an algae? To grow like crazy. And why do they tend to start growing out of control? What human event causes this lots of times? When we put what in the water that probably shouldn't be there? Too much nitrogen, or maybe too much, usually 1 or 2, nitrogen or another one of those things in your cycles. Phosphorus usually. And those 2 things can get into the water through things like fertilizers, runoff from fields, sewage systems, even like detergents sometimes have phosphorus in them. Those things can get into the water. Normally, is there a lot or just a little nitrogen or phosphorus in the water? Just a little. And it's what we call a limiting factor. Because life has to have nitrogen, right? Life has to have phosphorus. If there's not much nitrogen or phosphorus in the water, then there can't be much life. But if all of a sudden we put fertilizers all over a field and it gets into the water, now there's a lot of nitrogen, there's a lot of phosphorus. And very quickly there becomes a lot of what? A lot of life, a lot of algae. That's a bloom. This is probably the last slide we'll look at today other than a couple of pictures. I know there's a lot of words on here. Typically don't like to do that. We're going to try to look at these 4 groups of protozoans real quick. Remember we said they're classified based on how they move. The first group up here moves with a flagella called Mastigophora or Zoomastigian. Protists that have flagella. typically what's a flagellum going to look like? It looks like a tail. There's usually only one, maybe two of them on a cell. It acts like a paddle almost. Things in this group tend to be heterotrophic. They have to eat. There are a few photosynthetic ones, but not typically. They have these structures called contractile vacuoles. What's a big problem for things that live in fresh water? Yeah, let's say the fluid here was a protist. It's hard to imagine, right? And we threw him in the water. He's got salts and sugars inside his body, right? Where does water like to go? Where there's salts and sugars. In the fresh water, there's not many salts and sugars. Inside fluid, there are. So water is constantly trying to get into his body. He didn't have a way to deal with that. What would happen to his body? He would explode. These things collect water that's moving into the cell and just pump it back out. That's what they do. They collect water, pump it out. When they contract, what they call contractile vacuoles, when they contract, they're pumping water out of that cell. Water that the cell doesn't need. A lot of them reproduce through something called binary fission or similar to binary fission, like bacteria. There's a couple of examples. I don't know if you would have heard of either one of these examples. This one you might have heard of if you watch, you guys watch Man vs. Wild? Bear Grylls? When might he talk about something like that? I don't think he's scared of this at all. Because if you watch that show, he'll drink anything, right? It doesn't matter. Okay, he'll drink liquid from elephant dung. These are protists that live in unsanitized water. If you're out just hiking and you see a stream that looks clean, is it a good idea to drink the water? No. This is one of the most common things you can get from that. And what's the main thing that's going to cause to happen when you get it? It's going to cause you to get what's called camper diarrhea. We don't think that much about diarrhea in the United States. If you get really bad diarrhea, you're going to go to the hospital, they're going to give you some medicine, give you an IV, and you're probably going to be good to go, right? But in certain parts of the world, you get diarrhea, and what happens? You die because you dehydrate. Not a good thing. Now these other things, trypanosomes, these are actually really scary things. These things, as far as I know, you can only get in Africa. They're carried around by this fly called the tsetse fly. And it bites people, sort of like mosquitoes. When it bites you, it injects these trypanosomes into you. And guess where they go once they get in? They go to your brain. And they cause what's called African sleeping sickness, which essentially means you go into what? You go into a coma that you may or may not ever wake up from an insect fly. Scary stuff. I'll show you pictures of, I think I got pictures of both of these that I'll show you in just a minute.
Yeah, those water bottles that supposedly you can like dunk in anywhere and then like
They're a lot of water.
Like, do you think that's really worth it if I really went upstairs for anything?
Is it just the bottle or is it something in the bottle to begin
I
with?
don't really know. Just like
I've heard commercials, but I'm not sure what the deal is. My guess is there's probably some iodine or something in it. It's like a sterilizer, but I don't know for sure. I'd have to look into it. The second group we want to mention is ciliata. Pretty obvious, they move with cilia. Something that has cilia usually has how many of them? A lot. They're usually like short little paddles. You have a lot of them. And these things not only use the cilia to move, they also use them to sweep food into their, they don't really have a mouth because they're single celled. They have this oral groove, this hole essentially. And the cilia sweep the food in. They too have the contractile vacuoles to help them pump out water. Now, they can do conjugation. Now, that's a term you ought to know. What does it mean when single-celled things conjugate?
like crazy and with plasmids.
Yep, they're hooked together, sort of like sets, right? And they're swapping what? DNA. These don't really have plasmids, but they're swapping DNA. And the purpose there is to do what?
Variation.
To create some genetic variation in the gene pool, in their population. The most famous example of something in this group is the paramecium. And again, we'll look at a picture, but a paramecium sort of looks like a shoe that's got hairs all over it. It's like a hairy shoe. And the hairs are the cilia. The next group that I want to talk about is a group called Sarcodina. It's probably the group you're most familiar with, maybe. They move with these structures called pseudopods. What does a pseudopod actually mean? A false foot. These are amoebas. And I'm going to come back to this slide. I want to show you a picture first. Here's an amoeba. It's very liquidy. It flows, like runs. Each one of these little extensions that you see on the side, those are pseudopods. And if that amoeba wanted to move this way, it would stick one of these out, and then this whole body would just sort of flow to it. That's how it moves. So it's kind of like a blob. If you've ever seen the movie The Blob, it sort of moves that way. Sticks out as an extension and just sort of flows to it. But notice that eukaryote, it's got a nucleus, a membrane-bound nucleus. It's got lots of little organelles. Here's the contractile vacuole that pumps out the water. It's got little vacuoles to store food. It's got mitochondria. It's got all the typical parts of the eukaryote. So again, they usually reproduce asexually. They eat through a process called phagocytosis. And you know what that means now.
Good morning. Morning, test students, please report to the front office. Thank you.
What does it mean, phagocytosis? P-H-A-G, whenever you see those letters, what does it mean? Eat. So it's the cell eating. It basically engulfs stuff. And after it engulfs it, what does it need to do to it? Break it down. And how does it break it down? From the lysosomes, right? The lysosomes will come up and dump enzymes into the vacuoles that are put into that cell and perform what kind of digestion? Intracellular. Digestion inside the cell that ate the piece, food in this case. All right, let me finish up by mentioning two things. Some of these sarcodinians make cases around themselves, almost like shells. Some of them make their shells out of what we call calcium carbonate, which around here we may be better known as what? The whole county around here named after this substance. Limestone. Chalk. Scientists think that the limestone in places like Limestone County used to be these things, which meant that Limestone County used to be where? Underwater. You can go to mountains around here like Montesano. What can you find on the tops of the mountains? Well, when do you find limestone? Well, what can you find in that limestone? That would lead you to believe that Montesano used to be under the water. You can find shells. You can find shells of sea-top creatures on the top of the mountain, all over the place. Other kinds of sarcodinians make their shells out of something called silica, which you guys might better know as what? Glass. So they have glass-like shells. Let me show you 2 or 3 quick pictures and we'll stop there. This is a euglena, moves with a flagella.
Attention students, you go to your first period class first. There is a logical reason. It's for attendance purposes. Go to first block, just like normal. Then we will dismiss you to homeroom. First block.
Alright, this is the one with a limestone shell, and that's the one with a glassy shell. Pretty cool, isn't it? We'll stop there though. Y'all need to get the spare clock. My three